We were granted early access to check out Forza Horizon 6, and with that we have prepared a 40-something GPU benchmark, more than 40 GPUs, along with an optimization guide from Tim. And both of those will be on the channel very shortly. Before that though, I wanted to revisit the classic VRAM discussion because to my disappointment, we haven't made a single VRAM related content piece this year, so let's go fix that. Now, see this lovely footage that I've captured from Forza Horizon 6? This race was recorded at 1440p using DLSS quality mode with the maximum in-game settings, so that's Extreme plus RT. And to my amazement, despite the game being completely maxed out with ray tracing enabled, the RTX 5060 Ti renders between 60 and 70 FPS. That is an excellent level of optimization in my opinion, and best of all, the game looks great. Now, while of course I would ideally like some high refresh rate like performance, so over 100 FPS let's say, I think for this style of game, playing with a controller or a steering wheel, the input feels really good. Certainly acceptable. So high marks here for the RTX 5060 Ti. That said, I should specify that this is the 16GB RTX 5060 Ti because that is an extremely important distinction to make, and that's because this is how the game runs on the 8GB model. Yeah, it's really bad at under 30 FPS. I struggled to play at this frame rate, the input was very laggy. Again, this is what the game looks like on the 16GB model, and then here it is on the 8GB model. The 16GB model, and then the 8GB model. Of course, this isn't a static benchmark, this is real-world in-game performance, so a dynamic race. The difference between these two GPUs is night and day. Though I say GPUs, these differences between these two different GPU configurations is night and day. And it blows my mind that not only do these products share the exact same name, but the same performance claims regarding their ray tracing capabilities. NVIDIA markets the RTX 5060 Ti as delivering the ultimate ray tracing experience, but they don't tell you that the 8GB version doesn't have enough VRAM to enable that experience, and that's what we'll be looking at today. So let's get into it then, and we'll continue on with more Extreme plus RT preset testing. Using the game's built-in benchmark, which I'm happy to report is highly representative of actual gameplay performance, we see that the 16GB model has no problem delivering very playable frame rates at 1080p with the balanced DLSS preset, averaging 82 FPS with 1% lows of 70 FPS, and that made it 50% faster than the 8GB model for this comparison, and it's worth noting that this configuration consumed almost 12GB of VRAM. Now, this might shock some people, as I've been told many times in the past that you shouldn't need more than 8GB of VRAM at 1080p, which I've always found to be a very odd claim, but people have been making it nonetheless. It's also worth noting that this isn't even native 1080p. We're using balanced upscaling. What's also interesting to note here is that despite having to dip into system memory, the 8GB graphics card doesn't suffer from poor frame time performance, and while frame rates are certainly lower, averaging 55 FPS in this particular example, the overall smoothness was good. That said, we do have 32GB of DDR5 6000 memory, so with slower or a lower capacity configuration, performance would be worse. Personally, I wouldn't go below quality upscaling at 1080p, and if we use this more optimal configuration, the 16GB model is now 56% faster when comparing the average frame rate, but a massive 67% faster when looking at the 1% lows. This is a night and day difference, as the 16GB version was averaging over 70 FPS, while the 8GB model was below 50 FPS. Again, the game requires around 12GB of VRAM using these settings. Now, I feel the 5060 Ti is more of a 1440p graphics card, generally speaking, so if we increase the resolution to 1440p, but fall back on balanced upscaling, we see that the 16GB model was able to average 61 FPS, and quite incredibly, that made it 85% faster than the 8GB model, which limited performance to an average of just 33 FPS. The 16GB model was 82% faster when comparing the 1% lows, jumping up from 28 FPS to 51 FPS. Then, if we increase the DLSS level from balance to quality, the 16GB RTX 5060 Ti is still delivering over 70% greater performance, and more importantly was very playable at an average frame rate of 55 FPS with 1% lows of 46 FPS. Again, not exactly screaming fast performance, but for the maximum ray tracing preset, that's about as good as you could possibly hope for from a 5060 class GPU. In this example, I've dropped down to the lowest quality ray tracing enabled preset, which is labeled as High plus RT. Here the 8GB model is very usable, averaging an impressive 102 FPS at 1080p with quality DLSS enabled. Still, the 16GB version was 22% faster, averaging 130 FPS, though both did deliver perfectly smooth performance. The game requires around 9GB of VRAM here, which is probably why the results aren't as drastic as what we've seen with the Extreme Plus RT preset. Increasing the resolution to 1440p doesn't change too much. Again, I have enabled quality DLSS upscaling, and the game is now pushing just over 9GB of VRAM. But in this test, the 16GB model was just 17% faster when comparing the average frame rate, and surprisingly just 13% faster when comparing the 1% lows. That's still a big performance increase though, but not nearly as large as what you might expect when we're exceeding the 8GB VRAM capacity. The margin does blow out to 32% at 4K, and here the 16GB RTX 5060 Ti was really impressive, managing to average 66 FPS, whereas the 8GB model fell to just 50 FPS. Still, despite the game now pushing over 10GB of VRAM, frame time performance for the 8GB model was still very smooth. Performance overall was certainly much lower, but you could still play the game on the 8GB card. Okay, so what if we disable ray tracing altogether? How do the 8 and 16GB versions of the RTX 5060 Ti compare then? Well, if we opt for the Extreme preset, both are able to deliver highly playable performance, so that's certainly good news. That said, we are looking at 46% greater average frame rate performance for the 16GB model, which is an absolutely crazy difference. And we're also seeing a 51% improvement to the 1% lows. So the 16GB model is able to deliver a high refresh rate experience using this configuration. Now, quite interestingly, despite increasing the resolution to 1440p, the margin between the 8 and 16GB models actually reduces from 46% down to 37%. It seems the VRAM bottleneck that limited performance for the 8GB model at 1080p is bottlenecking the card to a similar degree at 1440p. The 16GB model, on the other hand, it isn't VRAM limited, but rather compute limited, so increasing the resolution has caused a larger decrease in performance, down to 92 FPS on average. However, if we switch up to the 4K resolution, but with the DLSS performance mode enabled, the margin blows back out to 49% in favour of the 16GB model, allowing it to render 64 FPS on average, compared to just 43 FPS for the 8GB model. Crucially, the 16GB version was able to deliver a smooth experience, whereas the 8GB version was quite laggy, despite consistent frame time performance. Now let's move down to the Ultra preset, and we'll start with 1080p testing with DLSS quality upscaling enabled. Even here, the game appears to require over 9GB of VRAM, but even so, the 8GB model does perform well, averaging 102 FPS in the benchmark, with excellent frame time performance. The 16GB version, on the other hand, was 20% faster, so certainly a big increase there, but with both delivering smooth frame time performance, the difference isn't that noticeable. Even at 1440p, we're seeing a similar thing. The 16GB model is 18% faster, though in this example, the increase from 83 FPS on average to 98 FPS was much more noticeable, and that's despite similar 1% lows. Dropping down to the high preset, we find an interesting scenario where the 16GB model is still offering 24% greater performance at 1080p with upscaling, despite the fact that the VRAM usage maxed out at 7.8GB, so less than 8GB. Not only that, but with the 8GB card, we saw VRAM usage peak at just 6GB. So something unusual is going on here with VRAM allocation, but we already knew that this is a game that handles VRAM usage in a highly unusual way. We're seeing a situation where the frame rate performance can be heavily degraded, but the frame times remain smooth and consistent while visual quality remains identical. I'm not sure I've seen this before, certainly not a common thing anyway. Then at 1440p, the margin is again reduced, the opposite of what you'd normally expect to find. Here, the 16GB model was 18% faster when comparing the average frame rate, while the 1% lows were identical, and again, this is highly unusual. The oddities with this one continue as we move down to the medium preset at 1080p with quality upscaling. The 16GB model was still 27% faster when comparing the average frame rate, and now we're seeing VRAM usage max out at around 7.5GB. The 1% lows were also 16% stronger for the 16GB model, but again, both delivered excellent frame time consistency with no stuttering from either configuration. Again, the margins were reduced at 1440p, which is the opposite of what you'd normally expect to see once the VRAM capacity has been exceeded. Here, the 16GB model was 21% fast when comparing the average frame rate, and just 15% fast when comparing 1% lows. So the 16GB model was certainly faster, but both configurations delivered excellent, perfectly smooth performance. Finally, at the 4K resolution with the medium preset and quality upscaling, the 16GB RTX 5060 Ti was just 13% faster when comparing the average frame rate, and 9% faster when comparing 1% lows. So we're seeing less of a performance delta at 4K than we were seeing at 1080p, which is very unusual. Again, we must be witnessing a situation where the primary bottleneck shifts from the VRAM to compute, as unlikely as that may seem. Now, all of the testing so far has been done with 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, but if we change that and go to two DDR5 8GB modules for a 16GB capacity, the 8GB GPU now has less system memory that it can overflow into. Now, I should note both the 16 and 32GB system memory configurations delivered identical performance when using the 16GB RTX 5060 Ti, as it doesn't overflow assets into the system memory, and under these test conditions, the game is far from CPU limited. But for the 8GB card, we are seeing a 9% reduction to the average frame rate with a massive 25% hit to the 1% lows. This means for those with just 16GB of system memory who wish to run Forza Horizon 6 maxed out, the 16GB RTX 5060 Ti is going to offer a much better experience. Lowering the quality preset to extreme, so extreme with ray tracing disabled, we're looking at an 18% decline in performance for the 8GB GPU when going from 32GB of system memory down to 16GB, with a 25% hit to the 1% lows. That means for those of you with just 16GB of system memory, the 16GB RTX 5060 Ti could be up to 75% faster than the 8GB model without even enabling ray tracing. The performance hit seen when using the high preset at 1440p with quality upscaling, it's a lot smaller. Here the 8GB model is just 6% slower when using 16GB of system memory, making the 16GB RTX 5060 Ti 26% faster. So what exactly is killing the performance of the 8GB RTX 5060 Ti, other than the obvious that it doesn't have enough VRAM? As expected, the primary issue here is texture quality. If we look to the left and rightmost sides of the screen, we have the 16GB and 8GB versions of the RTX 5060 Ti using the Extreme Plus RT preset at 1440p with quality DLSS upscaling. Now, if we reduce the environment texture size on the 8GB model, performance increases by a massive 34%, with an average of 43 FPS, making the 16GB model still 28% faster. It's not until we drop down to the high environment texture size that the 8GB model is able to almost match the performance of the 16GB version. However, using the high environment texture setting also forces the environment geometry setting down from extreme to high. So you can still enjoy high quality ray tracing on the 8GB RTX 5060 Ti if you manually adjust the settings, but does setting environment texture and geometry down to the high option reduce the visual quality? In short, yes, it does downgrade the visuals quite a lot actually, though you'll notice the lower texture quality far less than you will the reduced environment detail. For example, if we pause here, you'll probably notice a few things right away. Firstly, the vines growing over the road are not visible when using the high setting. There's also far less scrub on both sides of the road, and those are the super noticeable things. However, there is far more going on here. The entire environment quality has been reduced, and if we go full screen and switch between high and extreme, you'll very quickly start to spot the differences. Not only are there far fewer plants, but even the plants that are there in both versions are very different. The Extreme version features much fuller trees, the overall shrubbery is far more dense, and this is most noticeable on the tree just to the right of the screen. These sorts of examples will be seen throughout the game, and it affects details both near the car and well off into the distance. In this example, the stone retaining wall has significantly more growth on it when using the Extreme setting, the vines hanging down almost hit the road. But what really catches my eye when playing the game is the view. When using the high setting, unfortunately the forests in the distance are partially missing, giving Japan a sort of arid sand desert look which appears a bit out of place. So based on that, 8GB GPUs are now also responsible for deforestation, just when you thought they couldn't possibly get any worse. Lastly, I decided to create a long-run benchmark, as this can cause issues for VRAM-limited graphics cards. This test runs for 12 minutes, and I found this in-game testing to be even more favourable for the 16GB model. Here it was an insane 140% faster by the end of the test, seeing we're looking at both the average frame rate and 1% lows. Not only that, but the 16GB model averaged 72 FPS, so that's highly playable performance and an awesome experience, while the 8GB model maxed out at just 30 FPS with 1% lows of 22 FPS. It was incredibly difficult to drive without the auto drive feature. Forza Horizon 6 is an excellent game. It looks to be a big upgrade over the previous version with not only a larger map, but one that is also more densely populated. The gameplay is excellent, the graphics are spectacular, and in my opinion, the game is very well optimized. All of that said, to really enjoy Forza Horizon 6 in all of its glory, one of the minimum specifications that you will need to meet is 12GB of VRAM, though ideally you're probably going to want 16GB. This is clearly why the developer recommends PC gamers run with an RTX 4070 Ti or RX 9070 XT for the Extreme preset, as they pack 16 and 20GB of VRAM respectively. Interestingly, even the recommended spec calls for a 12GB AMD or Nvidia GPU, though they seem to have randomly thrown in an ARC A580 in there as well, because that only features 8GB of VRAM and won't be optimal for that configuration. Having now tested the game, we can confirm that the Ultra and Extreme presets absolutely do require a minimum of 12GB of VRAM, and this also applies to the base ray tracing preset, so High plus RT. For years now, we've been warning that any GPU only offering 8GB of VRAM will soon find itself only able to at best use medium type settings. And that is certainly the case in Forza Horizon 6. Now granted, the developer has called the preset high, but it is technically more of a medium quality preset given there are 9 presets in total, and high ranks as the 6th worst quality preset. The downgrade in visual quality from extreme to high is also very noticeable, and this is something we'll explore more in our optimization guide. But speaking with Tim, he's confirmed what I'm seeing. There is quite a noticeable difference in texture quality when downgrading even from extreme to ultra, while the high setting is really a massive downgrade as we saw in this video. Forza Horizon 6 also proves something else that we've been saying for quite a few years now, and that is that 8GB GPUs are without question holding back the PC gaming industry and, well, just PC gaming, limiting the options developers have to make their games look better. The amount of additional assets Forza Horizon 6 can render in when going from 8GB of VRAM to 12GB is staggering. It completely transforms the game from something that you might expect to see on console to something that should only be capable on the PC. At least that was the dream before AMD and Nvidia decided mainstream GPUs would be stuck with 8GB of VRAM for the better part of a decade. Now, just to be clear here, we are not attacking anybody who bought a GPU with 8GB of VRAM. You didn't do anything wrong by buying one. We're not trying to make you feel bad. The problem is AMD and Nvidia. They're limiting gamers to 8GB of VRAM. I get that the most affordable GPUs available right now only have 8GB of VRAM. That's very much the problem. It's AMD and Nvidia who have screwed over the industry, not the gamers who've been forced to buy underwhelming hardware. In the case of the RTX 5060 Ti, the difference between the 8 and 16GB models is truly shocking. For one, the 16GB model can comfortably play Forza Horizon 6 completely maxed out using the Extreme plus RT preset. The 8GB model though, it doesn't even have enough VRAM to hit 60 FPS at 1080p with balanced upscaling. That's appalling performance for a 50 series RTX product claimed to deliver the ultimate ray tracing experience. You can use the High plus RT preset, but as I noted earlier, despite including reduced levels of ray tracing, the big downgrade here is basically to everything else, texture quality and environment detail included. It's also well worth noting that reducing the texture quality setting below extreme on a 16GB RTX 5060 Ti does nothing to boost performance, as that model has enough VRAM, and therefore reducing the amount of VRAM required, when you already have enough, it does nothing to performance. It just reduces the visual quality for no real reason. And what this means is if all GPUs today and those of the last 3 to 5 years had at least 12GB of VRAM, the base texture setting would be extreme in a game like Forza Horizon 6, as there'd be no need to go any lower than that, meaning we could get perhaps a 16GB, 20GB, maybe even higher optimized textures and environmental detail settings, which could make the game look even better than it does maxed out right now. Sadly, the problem for gamers being that the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB is meant to cost just 13% more than the 8GB model, making it the obvious option. But because Nvidia and their AI goals have manufactured artificial scarcity, 16GB models now cost 53% more than the 8GB versions. That's a real FU to gamers and the industry who helped build the company. Of course, unfortunately AMDs know better, and while the 8GB 9060 XT does have the full x16 PCIe bandwidth, as you'll see in tomorrow's video, it still sucks when using the maxed out texture quality settings. And speaking of which, I better get back to working on that big 40 plus GPU benchmark. So if you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. Subscribe for more content, and we also have the join button on Patreon if you want to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness. It'll give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&A stuff, and behind the scenes content. So check that out if you're interested. If not, that's perfectly fine. And I would of course like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host Steve. See you again next time.